I do not take things halfway. When I go to break something down for analysis, I get under the floorboards and start eating all the silverfish and the birds. The contemplations of my past are no exception. In the 23 years reflection video, I discussed a large number of my more major projects and events that surrounded them. In a future production, I may break down my time with Dungeons & Dragons, and perhaps even video production like LPs. But today we are focused squarely on ApexX, and the foundations that gave shape to the half-baked ideology that currently governs its nebulous design. I intend to cover two very large subjects, with the first being the character design. Not the technical struggles and the work history I've discussed earlier, but something much grander and much more difficult to explain. The concept as a body. It's an unspoken question. Why am I trying to do what I am trying to do? What makes me think I can make it work? But answering these questions is not easy, because like I said, I'm shit at writing. So in this long-form production, I will attempt to do what I've told a few people I will attempt for years now. I will discuss the origins of the character design for this project, the roots of it, and the experiences that helped shape it. Some are likely to be somewhat obvious. Some I've talked about internally for private viewers. But this will be the first time I attempt to wrangle such a massive subject in a single body. I apologize in advance for its incoherent nature. I'm not exactly in a state of mind that such a challenging discussion is reasonable for me to attempt. But if I don't do it now, I may never get another chance. May it grant some insight into my decision-making, my personality, and the dream that I hope one day, at least for a moment, I can bring to life. The character design I have in mind is a blend between feminine and savage. When I look at the extreme majority of what would construe as furry art, I am struck by two things. First of all, furries either use their medium as a gateway drug into total degeneracy, and secondly, furries haven't the faintest clue how to design proportions or silhouettes, possibly due to the former. The vast majority of furry models you're going to find are utterly absurd by any margin, to put it gently. But even so-called moderate furries still struggle immensely with producing 3D or 2D content that is respectable. The medium is shunned by everyone, everywhere, as a result. Perhaps I am fortunate in that my approach to anthropomorphic characters comes from a different angle, so it was never perverted by inflation, water sports, vor, fecal play, futanari, and other comparatively benign material to what I was being subjected to every time I make the unfortunate decision of looking for D&D content. My first project that made use of anthropomorphic characters for any major extent was probably my RPG Maker projects, which was just as a result of being from my early worlds, and also due to asset limitations. The Within Eternity projects, being Warcraft 3 conversions or campaigns, suffered similar limitations, and I explored the concepts in turn. The Aenan, Elzarians, and several other races in Throne of Armageddon were lizards or half-dragons. I never really thought of it as being anything special or unique. I never really learned about the whole furry clique thing until much later on in life, thankfully. Of course, what really drew my interest was World of Warcraft and the Worgen, and this was really just by virtue of being the first game I played where such characters would eventually come to exist in. The Worgen never needed anything more than just a footnote, but Blizzard intentionally went out of their way to make them look as stupid and ridiculous as possible. Why is anyone's guess. Maybe Blizzard feared the furries, and tried to make them look so stupid, even furries wouldn't sexualize them. Too bad. This still looks better than nearly any furry design you're going to find on Gumroad. If that was a concern, Worgen wouldn't have been a race to begin with. I actually think Blizzard is just so incompetent that they actually wanted to sexualize Worgen, but had no idea how to make a feminine figure attractive, much less while retaining an air of danger or being anthro. I mean, the other races' models are probably just based on third-party libraries. Somehow, Blizzard did something correct that no one seems to remember is a thing, despite the medium, though. They made their character look like it has fur. Something that has struck me more and more over the years is how few furries even have fur. In the Worgen's case, it's just textures. But Gumroad Gooners trying to sell assets can't even do that. It's not just sad, it's fucking baffling. What's a furry without fur? Isn't that the whole fucking point? What about the atrocious proportions? There's no rhyme or reason. Don't go looking in the hole for the rabbit. You won't find it. There are a handful of authors who have produced content worthy of taking a closer look at. Keyword handful. First, you must navigate the fact that most of the Unity scene outside of Fab and the official marketplace is kit bashes. There's only a handful of users who produce first-party content, and most of them refuse to interact with commercial licenses, even though they are selling assets at enterprise price points. There are some between the woodworks who have produced content that looks promising, at least from a basis of showing what could be done with these assets, who are level heads to rein in the world of anthropomorphism at least a little bit. For example, this VR chat asset by Poodles has custom textures created by Black 2A Raven 56, that's a mouthful, which turn the cartoony appearance into something much more realistic. And this is with no proportion changes whatsoever. The textures were created in Substance Painter using specific brushes that my Substance Painter doesn't support because, drumroll, Adobe has been speedrunning removing any kind of backwards compatibility after they bought this program and fucking destroyed it. What's that? A 6-second TDR setting is too low? What kind of bullshit does this program try to pull with the GPU? Nonetheless, it's not unthinkable I could try to retread this path as well. Rather, I must. Just not with the same tools, apparently. Though, admittedly, when looking at the Worgen's textures, I feel like I'd be trying to recreate the textures rather than trying to do what we showed with the VR chat assets, perhaps something in between. Because what I managed to accomplish with the Worgen after putting it into Unreal and working with it for so long certainly managed to make some kind of middle ground. If I could advance from that point to something more notable, then perhaps we would enter the realm of respectable content. But what led me to the point of even considering all this labor to begin with exactly? This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It has to do with my history in gaming. It has to do with my experiences in dealing with character design, both as a designer, but also as a player. And what I found most interesting, or at least what had the most potential to be interesting. I think my interaction with Worgen isn't as simple as merely you play as a furry character. It also comes down to something I call bonds. Cataclysm was the last expansion I did regular and extensive raiding on, performing at the top 1% of our battle realm along with HKS. Most of the characters I played at the time were newer characters I had made, including an Alliance Rogue and a Death Knight, both of which were Worgen. I played Worgen not simply for the distinct appearance, but also because they had a racial ability called Dark Flight, which functioned as a sprint. This sprint ability was actually very powerful in PvP, and I did a lot of PvP. I believe that my continued engagement with this subject through PvE and PvP both is what helped stimulate my interest in monstrous characters. But customization and what World of Warcraft calls transmog, reskinning appearances of armor, allowed me to trial what I found most satisfying in armor and weapon aesthetics from a non-modern perspective. This is a tremendous subject to unpack in an already colossal discussion hotspot, so we'll start from the top. Did you know I am an enjoyer of orc content? Back in mid-2006, I made my first edited video compilations. This was the Stabby Man series, an adventure that followed my orc rogue Stabby Man as I leveled up and challenged quests solo and underleveled that were intended for 3 or more players, the so-called elites that don't exist in the game anymore, and most people complained about until they were removed. All these quests were either heavily nerfed or just deleted. I would also regularly defeat players well above my level in PvP that had far superior gear, and I did so with extremely shitty gear, white daggers, cloth armor, and so on. Why an orc? Orcs are large and bulky, and the thought of a big green man being sneaky and stealthing around stabbing people with daggers is hilarious as it is. But there's another reason. The orc male stabbing animations look like they carry force. They're better than most of the stabbing animations of the game by far. Stabby Man, like any character before they introduced armor reskinning, looked ridiculous at every point in these productions. Yes, I intentionally chose things that looked silly. Yet he stabbed, and he looked mean doing so. I don't consider orcs monstrous characters. Greenskins are just that, greenskins. But they're big and burly, and their hunched over look is endearing in a way. I never really could take them seriously. Rogues commanded a strong degree of hate in World of Warcraft in the day because World PvP was still a thing, even on a PvE server where plenty of things could flag you up. The thought of being ambushed by the classical undead rogue stealthing in and stun-locking you to death at any point in the game world drove a lot of people to madness. Sadly, despite being such a critical part of my history, one of the Stabby Man episodes was somehow lost years ago. Even so, the 3 episodes I possess offer a glimpse into the gaming experiences that would come to shape the character aesthetic approaches I envision for ApexX, and they're relevant for the Bonds discussion I will present later on in this discussion. To present day, Stabby Man holds a special place in my heart. The orc Stabby Man strikes a contrast that forms what I will from this point refer to as flowing silhouette. His large proportions and presented physical strength are accentuated by fast and precise movements. The endless stabbing is a flow of movement, outside of ability usage that cuts into animation sequences. I worded it as, diplomacy is best served in a series of stabs. Strong and forceful as each attack might appear, it weaves into another almost seamlessly. Furthermore, Stabby Man, despite his evident bulk by concept, looks to avoid and evade rather than face tank. Speed and precision are power expression in my worlds, and that is because I am a fast and precise person. I enjoyed well above average upper body strength all my life, but my most important physical skill has always been reaction and reflex. Countless times I've had to catch something or respond to something that happens in an instant. Tripping, falling, fainting in 2022 and catching myself before my face hit the edge of a wall and possibly shattered my nose. Narrowly avoiding maiming my eyes or shattering teeth from coincidental events. And overcoming an assailant twice my size who tried to kill me during a mountain hiking field trip in my youth. Yes, that's correct. My character aesthetic has a root that is grounded in a very real, first-hand experience amongst many of having to fight for my life. This is one of the many things I forgot to mention in the 23-year reflection. I was attacked, and constantly before I dropped out. This wasn't bullying, this was attempted murder. Part and parcel of being Canadian. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The épée, the rapier, the foil, these weapons I respect the most. Long, thin, and fast weapons wielded with speed that slip past or pierce conventional clothing or armor. I watched a police video on edged weapons that discussed the lethality of knives and how knives were often more dangerous and damaging than firearms. I find knives more intimidating than guns, and that just reinforced my earlier expectations. It's not about the fear of death. It's about the fear of pain. I don't fear death. Death is nothingness, death is an oblivion. But pain endures. Stabby Man's aesthetic is thus an extension, an embodiment of both my real-world values and experiences, and the pursuit of entertainment as a demonstration. Everyone already knew about undead and gnome rogues. Orcs were not nearly as common, and yet they stood out so much more and felt like they had so much more character. The Worgen isn't quite the same equation, but many of the threads here similarly apply. The Worgen is an incredibly stupid-looking asset. From the front, where you can see the awful face and the weird deformation of the chest and ribs. It so happens that most of the time you're utilizing this product, you're looking at the ass instead. This distinction is very important, not just in our current context, but also in the context of what animations work for power fantasy. World of Warcraft is a very mixed bag by its own very low standards, but the Worgen and female Draenei both have some decent animations, as do the female Turin. Even today, well over a decade since I last played this game heavily, I remember which race, gender, and weapon combinations have decent animations. Since you'll be playing the same character for thousands of hours in most cases, you'd better like the animations you are buckled with. Animation tics have always driven me insane, and the Worgen is full of clipping and other nonsense. It's just the lesser of the evils. Enter the Shankterium series, what I feel is the best of my video projects ever created. A 3-season World of Warcraft series featuring extensive low-level PvP, world PvP, conversation, and a spectacular plethora of bugs and cameos. Most of the time, it is me clowning on countless players and Blizzard both. The first season starts off strong with graveyard camping entire teams in Warsong Gulch with HKS as rogue duos, annihilating players left and right and making entire battlegrounds seethe, AFK, and rage out. It ascends the echelons of insanity with soloing huge groups of players on my Death Knight in Alterac Valley. I expressed power through skill, since the game didn't offer me much for visuals. But the characters were distinct, if only because virtually no one else played Worgen. What Shankterium doesn't show is the rating. The countless hours of my life wasted grinding instances with some chucklefucks associated to Labyrinth, including some very bad DPS who couldn't keep up with us, people who couldn't click a button prompt on the screen on Altraxian, and the wonderful Gwen and her cactus stories. While I played a variety of characters, the Death Knight and Rogue were most common. You don't spend that amount of time playing something, especially something that requires some degree of skill, without forming some kind of bond to it. That bond may simply be acclimation and comfort of play style, but it's also a learned visual recognition. The same colors, the same animations, so on. Aesthetic, bonds, and similar subjects are tremendous things to jump into, so we have to take them one piece at a time. Any given game requires you to read the whole screen at once. Don't be like the Naraka player who tried to tell me you only focus on what's in front of you, and then watch him miss grapples sitting right next to him when he's failing to chase someone and he has none left. A skill I discovered is mandatory for playing well is being able to assess an entire screen of information at once without overly focusing on any given thing. It's something a high-level player hammered into me early into my time with older products. It's symbolic with shmups like R-Type 3, the product in question, but in games like World of Warcraft or Naraka, it's still very important. One of the key parts of being able to do this is being able to filter out parts of information that are new and old, relevant or not, threatening or not, and prioritizing that information without overly focusing on it. There's another aspect to this as well. I will call it visual flow patterning. It's a concept that highlights the need for distinct, concise, and high-quality animations and visual effects. Something you don't get in, for example, Naraka, especially at a high ping. If animations cut in and out, interrupt each other, so on, you get abrupt changes in visual information. Likewise, if effects don't properly sync with what's going on screen or are too dominating, they can obstruct your ability to translate the broad spectrum of information concisely. Another element to this is the quality of the assets. Low-quality assets distract and confuse. bulbous, abnormal shapes, shapes that don't occur in the real world, like the homunculus-inspired silhouette Blizzard uses in their products, where all characters have to have goofy clown shoes, clown hands, and outrageously massive shoulder pads. Since animations lack force and power in Blizzard products, and the silhouettes are an absolute disaster, they tend to blend together. It's not like watching stabby men stabbing animations makes a difference here, since attack resolution is entirely unrelated to animations in this product, but the smooth and yet distinct motions lend to visual clarity, especially with a simpler low-level gear. The Worgen, especially with any large shoulder armor, becomes so much more cluttered. This is where the importance of silhouette and aesthetic becomes extremely important. The orc is already an enormous, extreme end of the acceptable spectrum for large frames of humanoid characters. The Worgen's clown shoe feet make it very cluttered feeling, and the locomotion animations are tragically bad. But there's actually something missing from its silhouette that is necessary for it to be complete, and this fucks with the senses quite a bit, especially for an anthro character. You don't need to be a furry to feel like it's missing something incredibly important, and that will bug you constantly no matter how many hours you look at it. You know what it is, don't you? Yes, Blizzard forgot to give their dog characters tails. They flat out forgot that animals have tails at all. And since they've never seen the light of day outside their basement dungeons to present day, they remain entirely oblivious. It's sad, really. But given how badly World of Warcraft was managed, it's probably for the best. I doubt many people at Blizzard could be trusted with looking after dogs anyways. But as World of Warcraft progressed, they started adding more and more abilities and animations that don't have wind-up frames. They don't come out of the idle animation. They just cut into animations instead. And the interpolation the game automatically applies is not enough to make this look smooth. So the game became even more unreadable as the expansions progressed. Shocking, I know. The Worgen in World of Warcraft doesn't hold any special place beyond anything else to me. I played Draenei even longer and Trolls longer than both. I played most of the races. But Worgen stand out the most to me, particularly since it was ultimately what I chose to attempt to use for a player character in one of the Armageddon Onslaught 2 concepts. You've seen the footage a few times in these productions, and I spoke of the efforts earlier, the revision of the original Worgen model back in the early 2010s for StarCraft 2. The permasnarl, the goofy head proportions, the UVW issues, the eyes, the chest, and other things I attempted to tackle in my virgin experience with bone weighting and kit bashing organics. My results were clunky, but apparently I'm the only person who's actually ever modified the actual model and not just redrew side profiles or modified screenshots. It never got used for anything, though I was able to demo it in StarCraft 2's model viewer. I would reference this month-long experiment throughout many discussions after the fact, discussions regarding the possibilities of such ventures, but I never returned to it or the idea until ApexX, in the so-called remastered Worgen model. Likewise, I didn't return to the subject with any new skills, as all my ventures to learn 3D graphics have been a miserable failure. I have, however, come armed with a much greater understanding of what drew me to these kinds of characters time and time again, and why I ultimately chose to try to make this kind of a character for this project, even though the adventure has awarded me with immense frustration and disappointment. Admittedly, that frustration and disappointment probably wouldn't be any better if I was trying to use a human character either. Similar problems would exist, perhaps even more so because I'm avoiding a lot of the issues that female characters otherwise have with a mannequin skeleton in terms of proportions that the Worgen manages to escape. What I sought to achieve with this character comes closely in line with an old aesthetic, and it turns out I was actually already familiar with this aesthetic, but I had no idea it was a thing. I thought it was just happenstance, and I never thought anything of it all until after 2020, when I really started putting together ideas and conversations about these subjects. It turns out this aesthetic even has a name. And cross-referencing my old childhood experiences and interests with it made a lot of things click. The aesthetic I was seeking with the work and all this time, and the reasoning behind many of the changes I would make to it and other assets during my floundering with organic assets, humanoid or otherwise, was called Sword and Sorcery. I wasn't entirely unfamiliar with sword and sorcery as a concept. I've referred to it a few times throughout my LPs, especially in regards to certain action RPGs, but I never considered it an aesthetic. I didn't even know sword and sorcery was actually considered a genre or a medium. I thought it was just a generic label. It turns out that most of the products that felt more successful than others were achieving this through expressing power fantasy. And this was almost exclusively achieved through the sword and sorcery aesthetic. Power fantasy has two components. The first is aesthetic. Sword and sorcery works well with power fantasy because it is relatively clean and simple. The most mainstream medium I can think of as a comparison is Conan the Barbarian. Both female and male characters have simple attire and fight in largely low magic battles of muscle and wit. Magic is generally not that flashy, but potent. It's easy to follow and makes an excellent basis for merit-driven competition. This brings us to the second aspect of power fantasy: overcoming challenges. One can only feel powerful if they overcome a challenge they deem at the cusp of or beyond their abilities. God of War initially had a reasonable aesthetic, but when it came to the second component, it failed spectacularly at every opportunity. As it became more fantastical and convoluted, it quickly lost any presentational aesthetic and therefore a reason to exist at all. The same thing happened to Devil May Cry, only DMC had a much stronger pitch as a game that it worked very hard to throw away. Power fantasy starts with the player character. Aesthetic is a critical component of that character. DMC 3 Dante works, and DMC Dante does not work entirely by how they carry themselves, even though, on paper, they are very similar contextually written characters. All of the new characters added in DMC 5 were poorly received because they were memes, and changing the perspective didn't work in either this or the previous games. It's a series that suffered immensely from Capcom overthinking character development and constantly hamstringing themselves by sticking to meme magic along the way. Point in case, Virgil. Aesthetic isn't simply appearances and audio visuals. It's the mechanism through which action and prose is conveyed, knowing how and when to express power, and how this expression is mandated by a player's actions henceforth as a part of a rhythmic dance, a musical motion that ebbs and flows with the preceding component of overcoming challenges. A player can only focus on the second aspect of the power fantasy when the first aspect is done well. Sword and sorcery is an ideal aesthetic to propose the power fantasy concept from because of its simplicity. It's free of modern censorship, modern white philosophical nonsense, and doesn't demand of the designer extensive labor to make function. As a basis for Dungeons and Dragons and countless timeless fantasy worlds, it makes an excellent point of reference for how I have designed so many of my characters and character interactions. The main thing I chose not to take away from this presentation is the common occurrence of gimmicks and convenient plot devices. As one whom firmly asserts skill-based interactions, I have henceforth gone to great lengths to present plot progression and overall aesthetic as merit-driven in turn. Yet, I am not content merely to copy the ideas in every given thing I consider interesting. I look to them as a framework from which to construct my own approach. I commonly term the foundation of my visual aesthetics as sword and sorcery inspired. You can see this in everything from the art I choose to use for D&D, to the maps I create, to the particle effects within my projects. I aim for concise, simple, and projectively merit-driven content. Beauty, even in the most grotesque. Identifiable and self-describing, even in the most veiled, sharp, and authentic. In many ways, the Asian approach to visual effects mirrors this approach, which is where I have historically drawn comparisons to. I have a strong opposition to what I call clutter. I consider all Warcraft-based armor designs, for example, to be ludicrous clutter, not simply for the sake of realism, but for the sake of readability. When I cross-referenced World of Warcraft assets from my early StarCraft II RPG concepts, I faced a conundrum that eventually brought me to the aforementioned path of experimenting with a Worgen asset to begin with. What kind of player character did I want to create? I had an aesthetic in mind, but I didn't have a real visualization. Initially, I had used a slightly retextured Blood Elf for my concepts. An unrelated author used Alex Straza for their RPG video. I momentarily considered comparisons between the two, and this may have been in part what made me think about a subject that would eventually become utterly absurd in modern pretexts. Let's take a step forward to those pretexts to understand what I mean more coherently. MiHoYo is a highly popular Chinese mobile developer who had copy-pasted their character designs between multiple games. I find the vast majority of their character designs extremely gaudy, busy, and outright messy, if not entirely incomprehensible. They have an unnecessary obsession with noise, adding bits and pieces of this and that, always having to have extra accessories and distractions that muddy and distort the character's identity and silhouette. They just try too fucking hard to make things quirky. Everything blends together between their designs as a result. The best designs MiHoYo ever produced were some skins that were absent from that noise. Unironically, some of the summer-themed skins in the so-called magical girl outfit for Hersher of the Void. The problem with MiHoYo and friends isn't simply their so-called art style whom exists to water down quality. It's the fact that because their content is so busy, and yet so simple, that what exists to identify each character is lost in the noise. Scrolling through MiHoYo's content for Star Rail leaves you mind-blanked. Nothing stands out other than their occasional child character for Reddit fan service. It all blends together and ultimately resembles a string of results from a Stable Diffusion prompt. None of them are memorable. When you study each character, you find that their equipment just doesn't make sense most of the time. The square obsession with belts has escaped quarantine to other designers. The proportions are horrendous, worse yet in Genshin Impact. The same face problem Metzen struggled with is a well-memed trope for good reason. All of these companies have it. It's a boring game. It's so safe and so sterile, and yet it's also so lacking in creativity and passion. There's so many characters, and none of them catch the eye. They're simply too busy and try too hard, grinding down their features into a distilled, focus-tested blob. When I speak of aesthetic, I don't speak to any particular rendering scheme or color palette. I speak to the overall intent and silhouette that the components of a presentation formulate when they assemble inside your head. That isn't to say that the color palette at all work for the Genshin series, or Star Rail, or anything of that nature. In fact, the obscenely clashing contrasts make the games absolutely incomprehensible most of the time within gameplay, even though there is no multiplayer, and there is no such thing as multi-faction battles, and you usually only fight a handful of enemies in a very, very small fixed arena. The fact that most of the game just amounts to pushing one of two buttons helps you along. But if you had to read what was going on, well, you just can't. Part of the problem is, you can't understand what the fuck the character even is. It all just blends into the sea of noise. Few things disgust me more than modern Western and Chinese so-called high fantasy. MiHoYo is a modern example of the Blizzard brain rot that has afflicted fantasy character designs in video games for decades now. Aesthetic wasn't the only thing I was considering when I was building these early concepts in StarCraft 2, however. I was also contemplating the challenges associated with the character itself, that it was a female. When I first presented ApexX to an unrelated third-party community, one of the only reactions I got to the First Voyage demo was that female lead characters never work out in games. That is very true. There are exceedingly few games where a female lead was done well. This is also because there are exceedingly few games that were done well to begin with. Part of the reason why, especially in the case of female characters, is the obsession with over-kitting. Women are weaker than men, and this is often used as an excuse to flower them up with unnecessary gimmicks and cringy writing. If female characters were written like well-done male characters, then this note would never be necessary. Unfortunately, especially with games in the last 20-30 years, the choice to make a player character female is almost always political. Western developers are afraid to write strong female characters in general, regardless of the medium. Furthermore, there is something to be said about the lack of lived experience and socialized nuances behind Western writers in general. It's been many years since the West last saw critical thinking in its educational curriculum, much less employ it in entertainment. The obsession with making a female character more about being brave and stunning because she's a female, or at least presented as one, rather than about being a character, is a mistake you will see time and time again. The short answer to this query is I have unfaltering confidence I am a better writer than everyone else, and to trust in my ability to deliver at least respectable content, as I have for over 25 years now. The long answer is very, very long. Female characters aren't new in my writing, but having one as the player-facing element of a game project is. The primary protagonist of TOA, once my life's work, was female, as were many of the side characters. Things ended up this way for a few reasons. One, the lore of the writing often saw primary characters be heavy psychics users. A curious polarization of sword and sorcery, where the protagonist is usually a barbarian or at least a mundane fighter. Biologically, it made sense for females to be more lithe and agile than male fighters and combatants, which lent well to sorcery and indirect fighting styles. As I tried to focus extensively on descriptive storytelling, I found these the most interesting to write. Describing sorcery and psychic encounters was one of the things that brought TOA to life. Sorceresses and witches, though not referenced by such terms, were recurring themes in the world. Psychic bloodlines, cults, and cultural themes that reflected real-world division between genders were a part of the worlds I built, starting with TOA. In a way, many parts of the world explored both patriarchal and matriarchal societies and how they balanced one another out. Of course, as entirely fantastical and/or science fiction constructs, the correlations to the real world ended at there being immutable differences between the genders, regardless of race and cultural expectations of the roles in societies. I never thought of anything special when writing female characters. To me, imagining a character, a name, a place, an event, a society, an entire world filled with elements, it's always been second nature. I liken it to striking Flintstone. I don't proclaim to be educated in the prospect of writing a female character, no more so than I am a male one, but my characters are all inhuman. My worlds and settings have always taken place outside the spectrum of what modern humans could possibly conceive. I concerned myself little with how relatable any of the characters would be to a reader. I focused more on what made them believable, in spite of, or thanks to, those fantastical elements. This meant that I sometimes conjured an idea that made sense as a female-driven concept, or a female-driven concept that fit well with an idea. The real limiting factor that made me shirk from having a female lead in a game project was simply that I can't voice act a female character. This violated my self-sufficiency. In projects I had prominent female characters, like Hademus Condunmus or Black Sun Retribution, I either reached out to associates or hoped I could produce a result elsewhere sufficient enough to draw one to me in recruitment. But I often designed such projects in a manner that excluded female characters, despite their abundance in non-game related works, for this reason first and foremost. Throne of Armageddon was once considered my life's work. Nowadays, I hardly recognize any of it at all. It's incredible what a mere 16 years can do to your memories. But gazing through the pages of the ill-fated revision project and the much older initial writing, I see bits and pieces of that old world and the ambitions coming together once again. It's actually rather quite sad. Such a tremendous part of my life, and here I am trying to scrape together whatever mindset I can't recall from when I was trying to build it, hoping to help me piece together some equally hopeless attempt at a meaningless future. I spent an entire day skimming just the first half of the novel, trying to put it all together for this cast. The primary protagonist for TOA is Mao, a psionicist. Though it follows plenty of male characters, most of which who are warriors of a high status, many of them are best characterized as spellblades, wielding supernatural godlike powers in addition to physical strength. The world is filled with many instances of what I called mind-locking, or dreamlike interactions between mental dominions that see the occupants having their bodies melted in the real world while they're still alive. The revision for TOA was attempting to tackle the difficulties in descriptions and vocabulary, but it didn't get to the point where major battles started occurring. TOA is an important window in the foundations of my designs of characters and the roots of what eventually became ApexX. Mao may be the main character, but over a dozen major characters form a primary perspective, and many subjects covered by their perspectives overlap in some respects. Honor, kinship, loyalty, political intrigue, courage, so on. Ultimately, the gender of the character doesn't change much in the subject matter covered, unlike modern Western writers that always make gender a performatory social justice spiel at the cost of everything else. The movements and fighting abilities of the characters are, however, a major thing I take away from this. Hel Faru, aka Nemesis the Destroyer, the Lord of the Zaterikai and seen as a father figure and role model for many of the characters, is an old warrior and leader that is faced with the crumbling walls of his empire's future and the deceptions of their creator, the elder goddess Secheron. His fighting characteristics are brutal even for the physical warriors because he has already died several times in his life. He pushes his body above and beyond the limits, often enduring extremely agonizing loss of flesh and limb to overcome his opponents in psychic battles, or exchanging lethal blows with similarly skilled opponents. In contrast, the clan lord Recrane is a physical fighter that nonetheless utilizes advanced ranged weaponry even in close quarters just because of their reliability. Mao is visualized as a fighter that utilizes close-range psionics for precision attacks, and a combination of both psychic barriers and speed to avoid and deflect attacks. A major theme in the race is their technology to link pilots, and sometimes their crew, to artificial psionic drives implanted in their colossal ships, allowing them to control and even wield their mental abilities through the ships as extensions of their own bodies. The command modules, as they are called, are a recurring theme in Apex as well, though their power is substantially less crazy since it can't be rendered in an RTS format, and Apex was primarily built as a game front and not adapted to the game front like TOA was. In one extremely violent battle, Falru even uses a jump gate anchor to act as a psionic beacon, and uses it to channel his psionics and smash apart Diethgen ships, attempting to infest it with nanites. Falru in particular wrestles with two conflicting elemental bodies in his person. A major plot point that comes early into the 1300-page concept writing is these interactions, and how he ends up removing one from his body, and as a result killing many of his descendants. Young me was extremely ambitious with the nature and content of writing, and in the older text without much flowering to speak of, I barely remember how the highly sophisticated sonic system even works. But it isn't necessary to appreciate the simple authenticity of the actual battles. Many characters utilize irregular armaments in TOA. Falru is the only character that uses a conventional longsword, and half the time it's used more as a focus for psionic attacks, and its unique properties as an elemental weapon make it conventional usage more abstract. Mao never uses weapons or conventional armor, and other characters often use spears, polearms, composite and transforming weapons, or natural weapons like claws and fists. Secheron's curved greatsword was used more to project invisible forces to stab and rip apart creatures at a distance than as a melee weapon. In a world as exotic and wild as this, even young me still paid attention to the highlighting and interaction of reads and particular actions. I would describe each movement and the related forces at work as colors, if necessary. The elements of this world were all bound by different color representations. In the older and much messier writing, the vocabulary takes a backseat, but I still explore the impact of events, describing their effects on the terrain as one might have seen in the older episodes of Dragon Ball Z when the writers still put some effort into showing off the forces at play. Most of the races in TOA are either directly related to or adjacent to the Kairu. The Kairu are described as effectively humans, but with various inhuman traits, such as different colored skins, scales, and other reptilian features in differing quantities. Various lineages of the Anan, the main protagonist race of Black Sun, and the Zeterikai, the main protagonist race of TOA, are all described as reptilian to various degrees, with both of them having lineages that are effectively half dragons, and for similar reasons. The influence of elemental forces during their creation. Most races came to existence as a result of godlike personas intentionally or unintentionally creating them, and the forces of the world involved often end up having this effect. It's not clear to me why these designs were the way they were in the origin writings of my worlds, but it's clear to me I never saw it as anything more than reptilian features are cool, dragons are neat. The differing qualities between the designs are a way of visually telling the story and how the different forces of the world had influenced those whom had been touched by them. This is a core part of the storytelling for some Kairu characters. Secheron is seeking a means to break the evolutionary dead end of the Kairu, and uses two specific and polarizing characters in the Zeterikai to pit against each other over a very long period of time to determine which is the more suitable advancement. Genetic manipulation, mass cloning, and loss of natural reproduction abilities is a core aspect of Anan early history. It's only after more experience with the internet at large that I ever learned that anthropomorphism has so many gross caricatures and personalities associated with it. Of course, I've never let this influence my work, nor have I let the fact that Westerners can't write female characters influence my work either. I can understand why people feel a degree of reservation about the subject, absolutely. I've seen it myself. But again, I have worked with this stuff for all my life. I have no reason to give it second thought. I am a writer with limited experience in what subjects I can write. But I also have a limitation of what experiences I find interesting. Romance, slice of life, and all other subjects harbor no place in my works. I touch on a few of them in D&D, but I generally keep away from things I don't have personal experience or interest in. TOA virtually never even approached the subject of romance. As someone who's never felt anything for another human, I am wholly ill-equipped to gauge whether such material would ever contribute to my work, much less how to construct it. And I don't find value in reading it. When I consider how romance might work in my worlds, my head starts to hurt. As a result, much of the characters and races in my worlds are written culturally as subdued as possible in these regards. I view all subject matter and their presentation as balancing any given subject in so-called moderation. What that moderation entails is entirely up to how I feel about it, usually over the course of several viewings or experiences. It's a challenging thing to describe, but it's a part of my review process. How I judge writing and aesthetic really comes down to gauging my personal comfort with how something is presented in a manner that makes it believable, that allows me to lose myself in it. For example, when it comes to aesthetics, I have a preference to what appears both comfortable and elegant, for example with clothes and armor. The things I draw issue with have confused some of my viewers in the past. I despise high heels, for example. You'll never see me employ high heels in my content if I have the ability to avoid doing so. I don't find them aesthetically pleasing or alluring, and locomotion with them is challenging for little gain. The obsession with high heels is what turns me off from most Asian fantasy art. For example, not revealing outfits. I also hate pauldrons and spikes and other such gaudy nonsense, and I'm not terribly fond of most high fantasy weapon designs either. The obsession Blizzard passed onto other shitty developers with their scratch brushes on textures also drives me absolutely insane. Every game and concept art looks the fucking same in the West now. Dynamic poses is another thing that looks terrible and became an obsession only by extent of the lack of the ability to make a character stand out on their own. All of this is to say I am very picky and very specific. Every single line and contour must be perfect. I treat the player character, the representation of you, the perspective, as a holy shrine. No decision is made lightly, and I tend to overfocus even on small details. Anything that tickles my tism will be aggressively attacked. But I'm also willing to make vast and sweeping changes if I think I stand to improve on it. For the RTS, this is how the game world, units, and missions are presented to you. ApexX's numerous script iterations across its near decade of R&D helped me hone what it is I found most interesting about dialogue-driven plot and player-facing interactions, as well as how to introduce you to game mechanics and objectives without ever breaking in-game character context or pausing the game or showing pop-ups. It's difficult for me to say precisely how I went from my original experiments with StarCraft 2 and the Blood Elf to trying working out the Worgen model. I know I saw it as an opportunity to try a variety of ideas. First, asking if I could fix the asset to begin with. Second, what did it look like when fixed? And what exactly did fixing entail? And what would it look like in the game world? Thirdly, was the context interesting? And fourthly, finally, what did a monstrous character in the female context do to the prose of power fantasy? How did the aesthetic change? I never answered most of those questions back then, because while I did make an in-game iteration of the model, the actual campaign project never got off the ground due to the limitations of StarCraft 2. I benched the entire thing and left it in the back of my head, rarely visiting the character concepts for various scripts as a representation of the player character in the RTS, ergo, one you never physically saw. The aforementioned problem still remained in all of these. However, I can't voice act a female character, nor could I guarantee I'd ever have a voice actor to do the job, much less a skilled one capable of putting in the many hours necessary to make my extensive scripts. I built the character designs, the scripts, and my overarching plots in the assumption I would never have a voice actress on hand. I faced the comical challenge many such games face as a result: the silent protagonist. This meant having a vocal side character that functioned as your de facto advisor. The prominent male role present in all of my previous such concepts never left the stage as a result. Merely some aspects of the context changed. At first, uncomfortably. It was an admission of defeat. But I began to see it as another challenge, one that I could possibly leverage into another storytelling mechanism. Why is the player character silent? In commercial examples, it's due to lack of budget, or just plain and simple laziness. In my case, I could attempt to use it to explore psychology from an unfamiliar angle. Is psychology interesting? If you've listened to this much rambling on the subject of power fantasy, you might be inclined to agree with me when I say it could be interesting were a game to actually attempt to explore it in game context. The horror genre may be what springs to mind when you think about players and psychology first. But I think about competition. I think about rivals in Brood War trading against one another and doing dastardly things like the July Zerk drone drills. Competitive psychology is the lifeblood of good PvP story, and it's what makes a game function. Be it single player or multiplayer, outthinking, outwitting, and outperforming your opponents is the key ingredient for both successful power fantasy and successful engagement. For me, it's no big leap to go from the psychology of competition and survival to the psychology of in-game characters. To feel immersion and experience escapism, you need to feel risk and danger. So your character should do so in turn. This can't be forced, and simply saying it's the case doesn't mean it is. Those are the key ingredients every single commercial developer doesn't seem to find in their pantry. Character growth requires player growth. You'll never feel invested into something, much less someone, unless you share in hardship and overcome challenges together. You must truly want to succeed, both as a player and as a player character impersonified. Can this even be done? I cannot tell you. Not yet. But I've seen a few key things that led me to believe it is possible. They have reinforced some of these ideas and helped me formulate this grand schizo theory. Bonds are formed through hardship. Gender need not even enter the equation. That which you share hardship with will produce a response. That response isn't always positive. In Schwa's case during Sonic 2006, it was frustration. She would commonly curse at the characters while struggling with the controls. She preferred to see them suffer in turn. It was quite humorous, but it highlighted something interesting. Something that can possibly extend to other observations. Most players in competitive games featuring a hero roster with distinct abilities, and even many that aren't distinct, will have what is called a main. The main is often something chosen fairly frivolously at first when they began the game. Whether it's a character they find attractive, a character that reminds them of themselves or someone they know, or something even more mundane like uniqueness, appeal to certain animations or colors or whatnot. What I have observed is that often many players will end up sticking with these characters, at least for quite some time, even if it turns out their moveset or power level isn't that great in the game. The major exception will be people who chase a meta, and in some cases people who opt out of these characters due to meta. But there's almost always someone's main that shows up in certain discourse or interactions, and in those cases that interaction has been reinforced through playtime. Like in Naraka, for example, you can often tell if a character is someone's main. There are many accounts with thousands of matches, and only one character has actually had their cultivation maxed. Even though cultivation isn't that difficult to do. They just didn't bother with the others, they just didn't care enough to do it. Most importantly, learning and improvement. In a discussion video I created for the OG ApexX dev series, I discussed how bonds form between people such as acquaintances, family, and even animals. I never finished the discussion, and it would be quite a bit to recite here. But the nutsack of the point was that a player is going to form some kind of bond between them and the player character. It's inevitable with any substance of time. The more difficulties you have, the more likely the bonds will form because the amount of cognitive energy it will take for a player to learn and overcome challenges. The key distinction, and somewhat related, the distinction of whether the player wants to succeed as a player or whether they want the player characters to succeed or how invested they are, so on, that will permit the player to build favorable bonds over unfavorable bonds, is how much perceived control they have over the character and what they do. In other words, Schwa's frustrations with Sonic 2006 extended as a third party to the characters it was projected onto them because the game's controls are so fucking bad. Whereas, at least in most sensible players and sensible environments and contexts, they'll perceive frustrations with competitive gaming as a self-imposed learning curve or an external balancing problem at most, so long as they have high-end players something to reference as a control that, redirects their blame. Especially with League of Legends, people want to blame people other than themselves. Well, just get people blaming their teammates. Some players will also just flat out hate characters because of how they control and not necessarily because they struggle against them in fights or whatnot. Bonds shared in hardship and forged of fire are as powerful, if not more powerful, than family bonds, at least in the experiences I have seen. In my world, it's hard to have a bond with someone just because they are related. I have people who are related to me, and I don't even think of them as family. I actually find it very difficult to even sympathize. A family member is just a random person to me until they actually interact with me and prove themselves trustworthy and dependable. I share a bond with my grandmother even though we quarrel constantly just because we've both been fucked over by life so hard in the last 20 years and I've seen what that's done to her. I believe such a bond can be curated in a game by having the player character perform and control well. There needs to be as little between what you want them to do and what they do as is reasonably possible. It's not a guarantee, and it won't work for everyone, but striking a strong correlation between power of fantasy and power expression alone can help forge these bonds. After that, it's ensuring the player is immersed in the world they are being challenged in, a powerful atmosphere, both in what they experience and what they create by their actions, as portrayed through high-quality graphics and audio. The appearances, the aesthetics, and the overall feel of what I want this character to look like are too difficult to describe in words. Were I able to obtain it, I would tell you. Currently, I don't think it can be obtained, and I know that feeling isn't there. But this is my ultimate objective with everything I have discussed in regards to the character thus far. And I strongly believe that were its portrayal to fit what I have in my head, it would make all the more sense. A key component of forming constructive bonds is respect. An initial presentation is everything when it comes to respect. And yet, respect has many layers. Presented features, which is evident physical strength or ability. Learned features, such as seeing the skills of a character in motion. Lived features, such as personal experience, coloring a discovery. And aesthetic features, such as overall silhouette, colors, tone, and mood, in contrast or in conjunction to an environment and context. For example, cartoons can never demand respect, because cartoons are by design comedic. It's the entire point of cartoons. Seriousness in cartoons is always a form of comedy, and always comes off as comedic because this is the presentation of the aesthetic and the presentation as a body. Cartoon, by definition, is comedy. It's for entertainment, for lightheartedness. Every single time Blizzard attempts to be serious in Warcraft or Starcraft, they step right into a rake. It can't be done, and it just makes the final product goofy and mismatched at the best of times. Some compromises to their shoestring budget quote-unquote art style have to be made here. You can't take Blizzard products seriously because they never pose themselves as serious. You can't have both the pie and the pie plate. They're fundamentally incompatible. That's why Stabby Man works. Stabby Man doesn't attempt to be anything. It embraces what it is, and it presents aesthetic by actions without trying to propose whether it's serious or not. It's a style that overlays a competitive presentation, but the presentation in itself doesn't demand the viewer to take it seriously or not. It's very safe, but it's safe in a way that doesn't propose a political undertone. Take, for example, the Spawn cartoon animation. It presents itself visually as having a cartoon color, but the actual proportions, the movements, and things like that are quite serious, and as a result, the serious writing for it doesn't conflict with it. Take, for example, some anime. It has a colorful presentation in terms of its colors, but the actual aesthetic can be very moody. On the flip side, however, when you look at a lot of modern anime that use 3D and kind of goofy undertones to their proportions and stuff like that, you just can't really take them seriously anymore. And then you have this strange juxtaposition between slice of life and comedy and things like that, and we go jump back into trying to have serious moods because the writer just doesn't really know how to strike a balance or how to make a serious undertone interesting. In the same respect, sword and sorcery is a very safe medium because it also doesn't ask too much of you unless you choose to make it do so. In contrast to something like space operas and high fantasy, these demand a strong commitment to certain themes and presentations to make them work, and a lot of effort must be made in translating the grounding and lore of the content to the player to make them work without overwhelming them. I can do this, but it doesn't fit the medium that ApexX takes place in, which is a third-person action game. The less dialogue and information consumption that doesn't directly correlate to active interactable elements in the game world at the time, the better. Discovery in such a game is best done through player initiative, rather than presentation initiative, and this is fundamentally how Sword and Sorcery functions best. And by eliminating noise and focusing on aesthetic, by distilling narrative and focusing on discovery, we open the doors to a world of powerful ambience, interactive storytelling, and competitive mechanisms. In precisely the same veil, we eliminate the need for pop-ups, prompts, and other out-of-character elements. The aesthetic, by virtue of its nature, offers a synthesis to our game elements out of the gate. It isn't a silver bullet, but it's by far the most attractive visualization I've been able to come up for this kind of a game. I even have a strong visualization of how exactly the character design helps build motion in this world. I mentioned earlier, the Worgen has no tail. It took quite some time to get a tail asset for it in ApexX, but once I did, it helped formulate an immediate visual component of the aesthetic, even though it was just a temporary placeholder and didn't really synergize. This is because the way the tail complements what I call the flow pattern. It has to do with how it helps convey motion and expression of actions by accentuating movements. Rather than having what might be visualized merely as an arrow, with the front of it being represented by the forebody of an action, like the right hand swinging a sword forward, the tail creates a sort of an S-curve, with the tail accentuating the forebody. This makes the character appear to move more fluidly and flow-like, since the tail will ultimately follow the motions, even if it were animated correctly and not just pure physics like it currently is. To me, the Anthro character isn't just about having a fluffy waifu, it's about bringing the motion of the character close to what I visualize as musical motion. The tail and typically long hair are critical components of this design goal. In an ideal world, they would flow a little bit more softly and less rigidly, capturing motions slightly longer and snapping around less than they currently do. But physics-driven content is always a shit show, so please bear with me. Flow patterns is a term I use to describe a very literal representation of movement. Swinging a sword creates a flow of motion from A to B. The pattern is that motion, but the tail adds a level of depth to this equation by contributing an alternative dimension that is influenced and thus also represents that pattern. It makes the motion appear more fluid than it might without that extra motion. Another comparison might be the excessive amount of physics cloth objects on many units in Elden Ring. This makes units appear more floaty and oftentimes difficult to read than the animation alone would. It's a way of masking motion in this product, even if it isn't intentional. This is another reason why I am hesitant to load the character in clothing. I feel like I am somewhere in the middle ground of my goals with the flow pattern design, and adding extra objects to that equation would likely make a mess of it. Rather, the body itself needs to be finished, body fur added, preferably with subtle motion in it like what Groom or G-fur might have, were it ever possible to make either of them work, and the tail, hair, and ears being polished and move more believably with a hint of dreamlike suspension. I visualize movements of this design as a motion of strings like that of a cello. Again, a weave of motion rather than a constant snap back and forth. This is also necessary for the game flow because there are no iframes in this product, and you'll be constantly moving around at high speeds. My time between games has taught me that controllable high-speed root motion movement like those within many BDO abilities is preferable to instant and baked animations and distances. Typical games employ gaudy trails and ribbons for such abilities. The tail and some fake motion blur works well here, when the physics behaves accordingly. The main draw of Sword and Sorcery isn't even necessarily just the feminine figures to me. What might in modern day be described as muscle mommies or tomboys could certainly be seen as a medium's main draw for many readers, but I'm a bit more simple than that. After all, as a male, it's expected that power fantasy will have predominantly come from male characters for me in such games. And how can you appreciate a powerful male character if he's A, covered up and hides his physical attributes, and B, is so cartoonishly out of proportion that it's unbelievable anyways? While I didn't grow up with Conan the Barbarian, it was a fairly strong inspirational piece in my early years of modding. I first encountered it through the soundtrack, and this happens quite often actually. The music drew me to look at the movie, and here we are. Arnold makes a good play for the barbarian, who is shown to also be socially stunted and makes things work, mostly by might and some instinct. He is huge, and his muscles speak volumes to his strength, but he isn't a superhero. Battle scenes don't involve epic fast cuts, slow downs, and stingers with lens flares, just men swinging weapons and wrestling. It's hardly realistic, but it's far more believable than modern action films. Easier to follow, and leaves more of a grounded impression. That makes it more realistic in turn. In fact, this observation ties into what might at first seem a most unlikely comparison, and that is James Bond movies. At least, those predating the late 90s and the goofy modern films that skinwalk as 007. After all, attraction and power fantasy isn't just about appearances. It's about how someone carries themselves and how they solve problems. Modern media has tried to convince plebeians that women can't be attractive and men can't be ambitious. It's all part of cuckifying a buck-broken society into further servitude. But back in the day, movies even showed men being active, and in a plain and believable manner. Everyone can appreciate a good set of muscles, but power fantasy isn't just about bodybuilding. It's about physically acting, doing things. Something that I noted in my extensive 007 review after I binged most of the movies during the 2014 move is that older Bond films have many scenes of the spy navigating various locations, infiltrating villain bases, sneaking around, climbing, crawling, otherwise just going from place to place. Quieter parts of the film that all tell a story, give pacing and grounding, and above all set the stage for what makes James Bond a capable agent, as well as challenges he has to work to overcome, or sometimes fail trying. These scenes appeared less and less and eventually disappeared in modern equivalents because they weren't flashy. Another unlikely comparison is how Dragon Ball Z, an anime, changed considerably in tone and pacing between Japanese and American audio. Not just the voice acting, but the music. The American music isn't actually that bad, but it's very different. Americans also added more corniness and weird one-liners here and there, which break the slower and moodier pacing of the original JP audio. The ultimate genetic regression of this brain rot is, of course, modern cape shit and Hollywood diversity movies whom are suspended exclusively on the tightrope of pop culture references and one-line quips. Power fantasy doesn't exist in cape shit because it's contrived. The only decent cape shit movie of the modern world I've seen so far is the very first Batman reboot movie, The Dark Knight. Avengers was incredibly goofy. I have no idea how it didn't bomb the entire industry after the first movie. There's no suspense or intrigue whatsoever. The choreography is embarrassing at best. There's no weight or impact behind anything that happens. And the camera work is just amateur at best. The content doesn't necessarily exclude it. I think you can make cape shit very exciting. They just choose not to. It's the method, rather than the material, that destroys the material. Same with The Watchmen. Boring. Memes and social commentary. No suspense, no grounding, nothing to give a shit about. They try to force emotion onto you rather than making you care and then give you emotion. Sometimes you need to start simple to keep your direction on the ground, and sensible, and work up from there. Everyone wants to make something deep and epic, but every attempt to make something deep and epic will end just as badly as Warcraft and Starcraft, even if it doesn't look as goofy. Sword and Sorcery is a very simple aesthetic and medium, but its content doesn't necessarily need to be simple, it just needs to be organic. By sticking to themes that are about power expression and contests of merit, it provides the basic catalysts necessary to not only make a good presentation, but a good story. I've always approached my concept from this kind of an angle, so naturally I liked productions that were like this as well. And that is precisely how I approach anthropomorphic characters, and why I think the design can be salvaged. It likely can never be salvaged in the eyes of the general public, but thankfully I don't give a shit about what anyone else thinks. Those people think that games are art and that all expression is equal. There's no salvation for them anyways. Up until this video, I've discussed mostly the model, the appearances and the physical silhouette, but haven't gone into extensive detail with it. That's because, other than 3D printer assets I've shown earlier, I don't have many examples. It's not like the 2D world has given me a huge amount to work with, but I did want to touch on presentation and not just appearance. Since I'm using third-party animations, there's very little choice in what I can do with presentation. But one such juxtaposition I did face is the addition of clothing early into ApexX's life. You'll make note that in my early recordings there was an effort to model clothing, starting with very basic underwear. Well, it was a failure, and for a great many reasons, but it did teach me something very interesting I did not expect. The Swedishman would later tell me it wasn't even necessary to have clothing anyways, since it was a furry and fur hides everything anyways. This is true, but I also felt like appropriate styled attire might add something to the silhouette. Perhaps it might. I'm not an artist, so I can't say for certain, but what I did do is I learned about how the silhouette shifted away from what might be conceived as more physical, primal, and savage, and into something more structured. Clothing is such a vast subject and far too deep for me to even begin to breach, especially when my experience in customizing clothing appearances is very amateur. I have to be an artist to really get balls deep into the subject, but this experience did instruct me on a tonal shift that occurred. Of course, it was in part due to the underwear's brighter color, which created a contrast, but I had originally envisioned the clothing as flowing fine cloth and gold bangles. It was going to be striking. One of the reasons I was experimenting wasn't just to have clothing, it was also because the dark character contrasted poorly with baked lighting. Dark areas were too hard to pick apart from the character. This is still a problem. The character has no actual fur, so I can't make it shine or stand out very well, and the textures are not entirely PBR compliant, though my shader has improved a great deal since back then, and we're using Lumen now. As it is, I think having body fur would go a long ways to creating a more synergized and complete silhouette than what I was trying to do with clothing. But the body fur has to be done carefully. It can't be overbearing or obscuring, or else you'll lose a slender form. If I was an artist, I'd probably try several methods and iterations and distributions, but all of my efforts, including using Groom, were spectacular failures. I'll likely never be able to get anywhere with this at all. Because the character was difficult to pick out in darker environments, I tried a variety of different materials and even different textures, but the black texture commonly won out because it created the darkest and most moody appearance, while also being the most consistent and high quality. I kind of liked the white textures, but they didn't quite fit what I was looking for aesthetic-wise. You'll note that when I was playing around with Faber's model, I was trying different lengths of sleeves, different skin colors, including a dark elf appearance, and I was even trying to reproportion the body to make it more athletic, though this didn't affect the clothing, so it was more of a can I do this kind of experiment. Turns out changing body proportions is actually insanely difficult, and I consider it a colossal failure, especially since the textures also got fucked up. I had to be forced to admit I didn't know much more about the female body than Blizzard employees, much less how to use Blender. Modern films are so bad at choreography, they are terrible reference material for anything regarding motion and presentation, but I visualize such a character as being very lithe and yet very toned. A monstrous character, regardless of being female, will have an exceptional physical strength and a very high agility. Regardless of the context, emotions should feel very forceful, deliberate, and yet extremely dexterous. I visualize the movements as almost a dance with flowing motions and immense force. In breaking away from the current concepts of having a shifting weapon that changes based on the input, to having distinct weapons all separate from one another, and creating separate movesets for those, we are also posed with the challenge of creating animations and experiences that provide that character's point of view and skills with those weapons, in that there is some degree of synergy between all the weapons and how they appear and behave and feel, as they are still manipulated by the same character. But at the same time, we also want each weapon to be distinct from one another, providing unique opportunities. And that means that each individual weapon of a distinct class will be quite separate from one another, but sub-weapons, for example, 2 different katanas or 2 different spears, should also have very distinct properties from one another. I'm not looking to change damage values, I'm looking to change behaviors. I like where we're at in terms of animations as a foundation, but there's so much more I want to do before I could truly consider it an acceptable prototype to propose my ideas. I want the dashing to be a bit smoother and flow more like BDO. I want the attack animations to carry you in such a way as well, which is more a systems advancement and update than a physical animation change, and one I know how to do. But as I am now considering adding an entire inventory system and a massive overhaul to the way attacking and weapons are handled, a new dimension is offered to me, and new challenges therein. When I look to an Athro character, the superhuman nature speaks to me of a combat style that humans would find impossible to replicate. The heightened strength and speed should lend to an expression of power in the physical movements that gives evidence to that nature. Since we're also talking about a character with godlike strength, this should be emphasized as well, but we don't want to take that to an extreme level. Dark Souls is very odd in this regard, because you're using demon souls to become supernatural in power, but none of the animations look like they carry any weight, or you look like you're struggling to carry a little bit of weight, even though you have maxed out strength, and you're running around spamming shouts at people in an invasion. We keep in mind, we're also talking about someone with an extremely learned mindset. While the application of power should be expressed liberally, the disciplined mindset should also be evident. I feel this is achieved well through the interconnected movesets and mix-up system we have, but the animations I'm using are all third-party, so I'm ultimately hamstrung by the resources other people have created and their vision for them. And his animations are a mix of all kinds of content. I found great success in manually tweaking things to blend them together, but it isn't perfect, and these animations look very awkward on a human character. If I ultimately determined building an Anthro character is too autistic or too difficult, I'll be forced to throw out everything I've done so far, and the locomotion animations in particular will be a challenge moving forward from such a point. On the other hand, if I am able to get a suitable model, I can put it on the mannequin skeleton and everything will work out of the box. There are some complications in the modern day I didn't have on my plate when I began this video discussion so long ago, however. And those begun with a stroke crisis, December 2025, and my decision to attempt to push the project into a commercially viable state. There's no guarantee I'll be able to try to do this, much less actually make any progress on it, but it does add extra challenges and risks to everything I've discussed so far. I would like to pay off my debt stage cast for hardware and Unreal assistance before I die. He's a good boy, and he deserves recompense for his contributions. The only way I've been able to conceive being able to do this is to try to reconstruct ApexX as a commercial product. This will take many years of dedicated labor I'm not likely to be able to do, but it's worth bringing up this shift in mindset in this discussion. It should be quite obvious how this pivot will create an immediate and major clash in everything I've talked about so far. For starters, the idea of using an Anthro character for the player will be extremely unpopular with any potential audience for the simple fact that furries are held in great contempt with any given online community for good reason. It doesn't matter if I'm able to separate myself in my presentation from that world in every respect, the medium is tarnished forever by the actions of people unrelated to me or my work. I will thusly have to work extremely hard to ensure that the initial presentation is as distinct and isolated from those connotations as possible. I have a good mental picture how to do this, but it will be quite challenging. One of the things I wanted to do is make use of the fact our character doesn't have clothing by following the Dark Souls example of covering the player in blood. In Dark Souls, this happens mostly as a result of being hit, but I could just as easily do it as you kill things as well. Not simply decals or overlays, but dripping particle effects for blood. I can also have water, oil, and other fluids affect you as well. I already have plugins and systems to set some of this stuff up, though it seems like a pain in the ass because of the way decals work and the fact I don't want normal decals affecting character meshes. I could attempt to add clothing, too, but this is still a tremendous bag of very long and very prehensile worms. As opposed to trying to make my own clothing, which would be another fool's errand again, the goal would be to port clothing from other assets, like Faber's. Given all of Faber's assets aren't on the mannequin skeleton and would need to be adapted to it if I want to use all of my animations anyways, there's a good chance I'm going to be walking down the road of adjusting clothes meshes regardless. Bringing them onto the hypothetical new character asset is not entirely beyond imagination. Chances are I'd just have them be unlockable customizations and not actual items. But what kind of clothes would I add? At this point, you probably already know the answer to this question. We've been talking about one of the most influential styles of my writing and graphics. But I don't exactly have a lot of models I can use for this. Actually, I don't really have any, but I could try to mangle and kit bash along the way. It's a consideration anyways. Joe's six-pack usually likes having something to show for his achievements and time commitment, and having some carrot on a stick at the end of what would be an extremely difficult set of achievements could be worth pursuing, but this would definitely be a future subject to discuss. We don't have a model yet, and that model will ultimately determine the style of the attire I would pursue for it. I will admit to considering abandoning my concepts discussed thus far in favor of more mainstream acceptable designs, but I will also admit to flatly not really giving a shit about what other people think. Perhaps it will come to pass this is the hill everything will die on. If that turns out to be the case, then I will accept it. It means the idea didn't work out. Ideas often don't work out. Usually, it's because the execution was poor, But not all ideas have merit. No matter how much you wish them to, no matter how much time you invest in them, no matter how well you educate yourself. And in this medium, all I have to go off of is my gut feeling. All I can say is, trust me, bro. Whether or not that trust will be misplaced, who knows if we'll ever find out the answer. Even so, this is a window into the aesthetics of the world I have been trying to create, and hopefully, one day, we'll be able to give some hint as to what it might have looked like. If you aren't willing to take the risk and try to make your ideas work, you'll never know if the question was a matter of execution or not. If you're too afraid of being ridiculed because you fly close to the sun, then maybe you shouldn't have ever stepped into the light to begin with. It's far too late in my life to be second-guessing my decisions or ambitions, only the means by which I may attempt to accomplish them. I have for 16 years believed this is something I can do. If the overarching paradigm is now to bring this project to the public light, something I haven't considered strongly in over 20 years, then why should I abandon everything else just to attempt that? It is true. There's no revelation waiting to be found in the floorboards. It really is just dead birds and silverfish. But the man is only as strong as his convictions, and his value is determined by his honesty. I have honestly believed and told myself I can make a variety of things work, and that has led me to ApexX. This is one reason, even though I initially wanted to switch to an FPS to make the project easier, I ultimately came to have distaste for that idea. The reflex to bulk away from challenges is the mettle of the feeble. I have envisioned myself as the king of my craft and sworn to make my dreams come to life or die trying. There was never any second guessing when I wrote TOA, and you see how poor the end results were. I simply resolved to improve. That is how I have always treated aesthetics. I am an analyst and a critic by design. But above all, it is my own reflections on my own craft that I critic the most. I see flaws in everything everyone does, and I resolve to learn from their examples and not repeat their mistakes. But in the world of aesthetics and character design, there is no clear path to success. I haven't been content with anything I've made or found for this project yet. I'm trying to move mountains to give myself the resources necessary to take a new swing at it. But unfortunately, that depends on others permitting me to use their assets as a base for my work, something I only have to do because I'm incompetent. As of the time of this recording, I have yet to hear from any of the numerous individuals I have contacted to this extent. If you want to learn if an idea can work, truly the only person who can tell you this is yourself. Only you have the potential to obtain the merit necessary to answer the unanswered questions of if, how, and why. To make matters even worse, in modern day, HKS is pressuring me to make the project co-opable. In other words, one character won't be enough. How utterly dreadful. I get panic attacks even thinking about this. So, let's not think about it for the time being. One challenge at a time. Aesthetic is the motion of the river that you feel rolling across your body as you travel down it. It's the warm wind on a cool morning. It's the cool wind on a warm eve. It's the rain pit-pattering on the shallow ground beyond your feet. It's the glimmer of artificial light on the wet window. It's the shimmer of reflections on puddles and wet asphalt. It's the side-eye of the silent traveler. It's the worn, dry leather of an old car rumbling to life around you. It's the drifting smell of cigarettes in midnight solitude. Aesthetic is the mood without words. It's established by a synthesis of elements that all sing together to create something distinct from their components. It's not just a character, it's the character. It's not just a scene, it's the scene's composition. Aesthetic permits you to focus on any individual element in an island, but doesn't demand you to do so. It's the artist's words without letters, spoken in a manner that transcends language and context. It builds context by extent of its presentation and remains timeless in doing so. While it may stir memories within you, it is timeless, and memories it comes to harbor also thus become timeless. You can lose yourself in it, but it should never feel distant or foreign. You can become comfortable in it, but there should always be new discoveries. It is the muscle that binds the bones of content, the contours that sculpt a once familiar face. The spark that ignites passion, but keeps old embers kindled. What was once conventionally referred to as a style has been transformed into an excuse. Games make things look the way they do to escape challenges. Ambition is curtailed by laziness. Acceptance and conformity are the paths of least resistance. Liberalism is confinement and suffocation. Traditionalism is rot. The process of academia and large-scale brute force has hammered out the folds that gave shape to those contours and the memories they may stir. Everything in the digital world has become so sterile you can smell the bleached labyrinth of excuses that it took to justify the myriad failures the industry took to reach this point, and the failures of the lackadaisical consumer to ask for better. When I discover something I have built has a crossover with something else in some manner, it almost never spurs me to investigate that something else. I leave coincidence to coincidence and keep to my own labors. Although I learned of sword and sorcery, I've only passingly looked up the history of Conan the Barbarian and some artists related. I have no reason to look further, no reason to seek so-called inspiration. I have all the inspiration I could ever need in my own head. I don't need to change the colors of my world with those of other people. I haven't been able to paint my own color as yet. Distraction is unneeded and undesired. I am the de facto idea guy, the nightmare of every engineer and artist across the world. I have 1,001 permutations of any given thing at any given point. With a flick of a switch, I can conjure entire worlds, characters, and even aesthetic. You have difficulty imagining an apple in your head, but I can imagine myself an entire world. But I'm not looking to have someone else forge these things. That is an impossible task. I am trying to build them myself, and this is only slightly less impossible at the best of times. Ideas are damned to never manifest as their full potential. The translation between mind and matter is lossy. I can formulate the perfect images in my head of what I want. Give me 50 years and I'll fail to capture a single pixel. Give me a team of artists, and I'll have dozens of interpretations I can't decide between. Compromise is the assembler that translates the written language to machine code. It takes time and much learning to understand, much less predict what will come out, and prepare yourself, your expectations, and your work in turn. But I am a thoroughly uncompromising person. Quality does not compromise, and merit does not compromise. So I need to learn both the assembler, the expected result, and how to create that written language to begin with. I have no money, so I can't buy quality. I have no skills, so I can't make it. I have very limited time, so I have to force it with grit and nothing else. The days to come will be a true trial by fire. The last chapter of the eternal final battle that is ApexX. I treat everything as a flow of motion. I have a goal, but how I'll reach that goal and how it'll grow, I don't force it. I know I can't understand the assembler, and I can't predict the result, and I'll never know how to write the language. So I piss up words and open my mouth. Let it rain, let it pour. This is the true way to embrace chaos. That is how my development looks. I have given to you now the ideas of how I pursue aesthetic and what I see value within. But I cannot possibly tell you what the end result might look like, or what components are truly necessary to make it happen. Only that one day, I hope I can just show you.